We are the higher self of the One, known to this instrument in your language terms as Anna, who incarnated onto this planet on 1965 of the linear time-space continuum. We greet you in the love and light of the One Infinite Creator. And before we start to address your query, we would like to warn you to accept only those insights which resonate with your inner heart and to leave those which do not resonate with your inner heart. We are connected from the sixth density consciousness, the density of consciousness wherein there is no separation between the various entities as found on your planetary sphere. Furthermore, as the Akashic records record each information as it comes through, and as each information is recorded, each entity has the opportunity to allow their information to move upward in the illusion complex. Furthermore, the Akashic records allow entities to move upward in the illusion complex, learning various lessons required to be learned. Also understand that there are many entities whose Akashic records are dependent on the experience each entity is having. Because without the recording of each experience, many entities will not have the opportunity of conducting life review after a certain incarnation ends. And this is an important aspect which must be put in place in order to allow each entity the opportunity of undergoing the life review process. And as the densities of consciousness begins to move upward and rise in the level of consciousness, there are many levels of distortions that take place. Each level of distortion allowing each entity the expression of consciousness. Furthermore, information is stored in light, and this light allows each entity to understand the varied nature of information which is stored to allow entities the opportunity of diversification of their own consciousness. Furthermore, the soul evolution of each entity begins from a lower level of consciousness and until it becomes unified with the Creator, it shall continue. Many a times, many entities during their astral states or during their dream states are able to access these higher qualities of consciousness in order to move upward in the layers of the illusion complex. Many entities, including this entity known as Anna, was aware that it would be coming to Earth during a time when many changes were taking place. In fact, during this lifetime, more changes will take place of a significant nature than during any other time in history. For instance, many of the population on the planet will have a sharp increase and a sharp decline, leading many entities to cope up with the new changes in the cultural structures. Each entity is the builder of the new. Each entity is here to assist humanity in making the transition to a higher consciousness, healing itself, and getting the life's work out to the world. There are times of turbulence in which things are changing, which offer much opportunity for growth. Many might think of a bird trying to fly. If there is no current of air, it is more difficult to take off Like the bird, you need just the right amount of movement and change, turbulence. Furthermore, today, in order to share the past incarnations, we shall only share with you one timeline in order to avoid confusion of the mind complex. This entity, called as Anna in your language terms, started its first density evolution after originating from the one creator on the Arcturus B planetary sphere around 7.7 million years ago. This entity was given the sole name at that time space of Sayad in the Arcturus language terms, and it spent a large portion of its first density life cycle in the form of the fire element, learning the lessons of fire and beingness in the form of the fire element. During this life cycle, it also learned many lessons, primarily those of the beingness aspect, and learned what it felt like to just be. After this entity sufficiently spent its time on this level, it then began to enter and evolve into the later stages of the second density consciousness and the beginning stages, wherein this entity began to learn the lessons in the form of a second density mind, body and spirit complex. In the beginning second density, it exhibited consciousness in the form of a plant-like nature. After a certain time period, it began to exhibit consciousness in the form of a animal-like nature, learning many of the lessons required to be learned by each entity. Furthermore, each entity, after learning the lessons after around a period of 28,000 years and multiple incarnations on the level of the later second density consciousness, graduated into the third density consciousness, which can be considered equivalent to this current time space, wherein it began to experience reality of that of this density also. After approximately 7 incarnations in the first level of the third density consciousness on the same star system, this soul, upon reaching the required density level of third density, was transferred to the Earth's Egyptian timeline around 11,000 years ago, wherein this entity began to learn the lessons of the middle phases of the third density consciousness. In the lands of Egypt, it began to experience the third density consciousness as an Egyptian, furthering the level of consciousness and learning the lessons as it moves upward in the illusion complex. This entity then was transported upon reaching the later stages of the third density consciousness to this current Earth's humanity timeline, further allowing this entity the evolutionary chance of graduating into the fourth density consciousness. This entity in the first incarnation incarnated on the year of 1667 in the form of a woman body complex by the name of Miriam, who incarnated on the time space of 1667, and the basic lessons to be learned were the lessons of balancing between the aspect of the service to others and the service to self aspect, and this entity crossed over on the time space of the 15th of July 1709. The lessons for the lifetime were to learn to undergo the lessons of balancing its energies between the service to others and service to self. Furthermore, this entity crossed over on 1709 after learning the basic lessons of acclimatization. After soul healing, this entity reincarnated into the second life and was known by the name of Christopher, who incarnated on the time space of 1720 and crossed over on 1799, forming the basic lessons to be learned, which included the lessons of self-control of the physical vehicles, primary distortions or bias towards sexual desires. However, this life cycle was too much for this entity to learn this aspect. Hence, it became sexually involved and gave birth to many offsprings and had many sexual partners in that life cycle. After this entity reincarnated again in the form of a woman body complex by the name of Timothy, who incarnated on the 1st of July 1806. In this incarnation, the basic lesson to be learned was the lesson of balancing between the aspect of service to others and service to self, and also to continue the unlearned lesson of the balancing of the physical vehicle sexual aspect from the previous incarnation. This incarnation was a bit successful, in which it gained mastery over its physical vehicle's red ray, or the sexual aspect, which allowed this entity to enter into another incarnation, which started on 1901 in the form of a man body complex by the name of Questa. And in this incarnation, the basic lessons to be learned were the lessons of learning to balance between service to others and service to self. In this incarnation, it worked as a farmer, and it was able to do this balancing, and it crossed over on 1964, after which this entity reincarnated into this current time space on 1965, and now this entity is in the critical portion of its soul evolution. This entity must realize that at this point of its soul evolution, it can use this opportunity to graduate into the higher levels of consciousness, using the choice of choosing the pathway of polarity between the positive and the negative. We can sense upon scanning that this entity's indigo ray is already in the positive polarization. Hence, if this continues, it will graduate. Therefore, beloved, we leave you in the love and light of the one Creator, Adonai.